Hello and welcome to my lecture on paternalism. In this lecture I'm going to explain John Stuart Mill's Objections to Paternalism, followed by Thaler and Sunstein's idea of Libertarian paternalism, followed by some objections to Libertarian paternalism. So first, let me explain what paternalism is. In political philosophy, we generally understand paternalism as a type of action that tries to change people's choices for their own good. Traditionally, this is usually coercive. For example, you have drug laws by which the government prohibits people from ingesting certain drugs which are thought to be bad for their health or otherwise to harm their lives. And the main motivation for this is to benefit the would-be drug users themselves. And then so they are threatened with some kind of punishment if they engage in this behavior that the government thinks would harm themselves. Another example is seatbelt laws, by which it's obligatory to wear a seatbelt when you're in the car. And that is mainly for the protection of yourself rather than for the protection of other people, like most laws. Among the most famous opponents of paternalism was the great 19th century utilitarian philosopher John Stuart Mill, who advanced what is now called the harm principle. This is a quotation from his essay on liberty. He says, "The only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. His own good, either physical or moral, is not a sufficient warrant." So that would rule out paternalistic laws, and we're going to talk about why he thought that in a second. John Stuart Mill had a couple of arguments against paternalism. So the first was a utilitarian argument. He thinks that people usually choose prudently for themselves, or at least they do a better job of looking out for their own interests than third parties would do of looking out for their interests. There are two reasons for this. The first is that basically you have more knowledge of your own interests than other people do, and you have more knowledge of your own interests than you have of other people's interests. So if you're going to have people looking out for somebody's interests, it makes the most sense for each person to be looking out for their own interests. For example, you have these drug users who the government thinks they're harming themselves, but perhaps the drug users know what their own interests are better. So perhaps the government doesn't know exactly how enjoyable these illegal drugs are, and the people who are actually using them do know. People differ from each other a lot, and so you can't really tell how much somebody else enjoys something or how much something is going to benefit them in general just based upon your own case. The other reason is people have more concern for their own interests than they have for the interests of other people. So if you have some third party who's trying to look out for your interests, they're probably not going to do a good job of it because they probably just don't care that much about you, and you care a lot more about yourself. So it doesn't really make sense for this third party to be trying to override your choices about your own good based upon their opinions about what's good for you. Now here's the second argument against paternalism. It's the value of autonomy. First of all, some people think that autonomous choice is just intrinsically good, and of course paternalism interferes with that. It enables a third party to substitute their judgment for yours and thereby interferes with your freedom. Also, autonomy might be instrumentally good because it might help you develop your character and your ability to make choices. It might make you more self-reliant and rational and so on if you're able to choose for yourself as opposed to if somebody else is making choices for you. Now, there are some exceptions to Mill's opposition to paternalism. First of all, you can engage in paternalism towards mentally incompetent people, that is, people who are not able to make intelligent and rational decisions, such as children and people who are insane or seriously mentally ill. Another exception is you're not allowed to sell yourself into slavery. More precisely, if you make a contract to sell yourself into slavery, in Mill's opinion, the government should not enforce that contract. So if the other person with whom you made the contract then goes to the courts to try to enforce it, the courts should reject the contract. Another exception is for what we call soft paternalism. In Mill's opinion, and this is widely accepted among libertarians and other people who usually oppose paternalism, you can interfere with a subject for their own good if you have good reason to think that the subject would agree with what you're doing if they were fully informed. So Mill gives this example. There's a person riding a horse towards a bridge, and unknown to the rider, the bridge is damaged, and therefore, if the rider goes across the bridge, he's probably going to fall through into the river. You can reasonably assume that the rider would not want that to happen, and thus, if he knew, he would want to be stopped from riding across the bridge, and so it is okay, in Mill's opinion, and that of most people, to forcibly stop the rider so that you can inform him. Okay, now on the other hand, if the rider actually wants to commit suicide, so if he actually already knows that the bridge is going to collapse and that's what he wants, then you have to let him do it. That is the opposition to paternalism. So what I just explained was a pretty traditional libertarian view about paternalism, and also was widely held among economists. In recent years, there's been a new idea called Libertarian paternalism, which was introduced by the economist Richard Thaler and the legal theorist Cass Sunstein. So Libertarian paternalism is supposed to get around the objections to traditional paternalism. Libertarian paternalism is a type of paternalism that would use, quote, nudges, as they call it, which is techniques of influencing people's behavior, for example, by changing the way that choices are presented, but without actually coercing them and without imposing any large costs. So you try to set up a default choice that you think is going to be good for the person, but they are allowed to opt out of it and they don't have to take any large costs if they want to opt out. There are a couple of arguments in favor of this. So there's a kind of utilitarian argument. Thaler and Sunstein point out that people do not, in fact, choose rationally all the time or anywhere close to all the time. There is various psychological research on heuristics and biases and fallacies that people are subject to. For example, they commit the sunk cost fallacy. They have hyperbolic discounting, which is like being extremely biased towards the near term and not taking into account the long term. There are a couple of examples that Thaler and Sunstein mention of consequences of this. So one example is something like 60% of Americans, they say, are either obese or overweight. And the majority of these people would probably agree that they would like to not be overweight. But because of weakness of will and so on, they keep overeating or not exercising and so on. Another example has to do with retirement plans. Most people agree that you should save for retirement, but a lot of people just put this off for a long time if it's just left completely up to them and nobody else takes any action. And then, they wait until it's too late to save very much. Okay, and so then they are going to be poor during their retirement. Now, what about the autonomy argument against paternalism? Thaler and Sunstein have some responses to that. Now, what they say in the article is that, quote, some paternalism is unavoidable, but I think this was actually just a misstatement because the thing that they're saying is unavoidable isn't exactly paternalism. What they should have said was that some amount of external influence on people's choices is unavoidable. Right, so the point that they make is that frequently the paternalistic option is not any more autonomy compromising than the alternatives. Right, so individuals' choices are always going to be influenced by some external forces. The question is just whether we want them to be influenced in a benevolent way or in a not benevolent way. There are a couple of examples that illustrate this. So they use the example of food in a cafeteria. So let's say that you run a cafeteria, maybe at a university or at some large business, and you found out that if you put the fruit before the sugary desserts, then more people will eat fruit and fewer people will eat the desserts that are bad for them. And so you could arrange things in a way that will cause people to make the healthier choices, right? Maybe put the healthy foods earlier in line than the less healthy foods. Okay, now there's no option whereby you're not putting them in some order. So whatever order you put the foods in, that is going to influence people's choices. And so any order of putting the food, is equally autonomy compromising or not. If you think that there being some influence on people's food choice by the arrangement of foods compromises autonomy, well then it's going to be compromised no matter what because you have to put the food in some order or other. The other example is with retirement plans. All right, so most employers have a retirement plan for the employees, and a certain amount of money gets contributed every month from the employee's salary. Now, there has to be a default contribution amount. That is, if the employee doesn't do anything, if he doesn't ask to have a certain amount added to the retirement account, what will the amount be? The default could be 0. It could be that you get nothing added to your retirement plan if you don't ask for it, or it could be $100, or it could be 5% of their income, or whatever. Okay, there's no way of not having any default decision here, right? There has to be some amount that goes in. It could be 0, but it's got to be something, right? And so if you think that having an influence from the employer's decision as to what the default should be, if you think that compromises autonomy, then the employee's autonomy is automatically compromised because there's automatically going to be a default. All right, so we just have to decide whether we want the default to be something that's benevolently motivated or not. And if that's the choice, it seems like obviously you should have it be a benevolent default that that you think would be good for most people. Okay, there's another response to the autonomy argument, which is that actually people's choices often are not autonomous anyway, because people suffer from weakness of the will. So there are times when a person knows that they should be doing something and that action would be consonant with their own values. It's not that an external person is substituting their values for the person's values, right? It's that a person is failing to act up to their own values. As in the case of the people who are on a diet and they go off the diet, right? What they really want, or what is fundamentally in line with their values, is to stay on the diet so that they can be healthy and lose weight. But they just fail periodically due to temptation. So in this case, having some libertarian paternalist around might actually help people act in line with their own values, right? Not with the external person's values, right? Helping you act along with your own values. So that could actually be construed as assisting your autonomy rather than interfering with it. Okay, now Sunstein and Thaler have this discussion of, given that you have to choose a default in many circumstances, something that happens if people don't take any particular action, how should you choose the default? And they just discuss these 3 options, which are interesting and possibly worth using in some circumstances. First option is to choose what most people would choose if they were forced to make an explicit choice. Of course, you have to have some kind of data to guess at this. The second option is actually force everyone to make an explicit choice. The third option is make the default be the thing that results in the fewest opt-outs. And you need some empirical evidence to detect this. But they say, for example, that if you have everybody get enrolled in a retirement plan automatically, if an employer does that as the default, then very few people opt out. On the other hand, if the default is no retirement plan, then a larger number of people are going to want to change the default. So you should make the default be the thing such that if that's the default, not very many people will want to change from the default. Okay, now there's a related idea which is not discussed in the article, but is discussed in their larger book, which is called Nudge. It's the idea of libertarian moralism. That's my term, not theirs. It's that we can adjust defaults and adjust choice situations in order to produce morally better results. Note that this is not really libertarian paternalism, because this is not something that we would do for a person's own benefit, but for the benefit of others. So an example of this is when you get a driver's license, you can decide to be an organ donor, which means that if you die in some way such that your organs are still intact and usable, then doctors can take your organs and transplant them into somebody who needs them. Now, we could make it so the default is that everyone is an organ donor in this sense, unless they specifically ask not to be. Now, I believe that the current situation is the default is to opt in. You have to say that you want to be, and if you don't say anything, then you're not. So we could reverse it so the default is that you do donate your organs when you die, unless you say otherwise. Okay, that would be libertarian moralism. Now I'm going to talk about objections to libertarian paternalism. These are from David Gordon, who is a libertarian philosopher who wrote a book review of Thaler and Sunstein's book, Nudge. Right, so one of the things that Gordon says is, if people want to have benevolent outside influences, they can arrange for themselves to have these influences. So, for example, if you're on a diet and you want to prevent yourself from straying from the diet, you could make a contract with a friend according to which, you lose money if you go off your diet. Like you could make a bet that you're going to stay on the diet, and then if you go off the diet, then you have to pay the friend $100 or something, right? And so that would be a way of kind of trying to manipulate yourself, kind of in the same way that Sunstein and Thaler are suggesting that third parties should try to manipulate you, right? And Gordon's idea is, you can just arrange to have this done to yourself if you want that sort of thing done to you. So there's no need for anybody else to do that. Like the free market can take care of it, so to speak. Okay, the other thing that Gordon says is, it actually is not always necessary to choose a default. You can have a situation where the government simply does nothing. Now, I was not exactly sure how he thought that there could not be a default, but he gives the example of organ transplants. He thinks that there does not have to be any default situation there. Now, as far as I can tell, what he means is the government should just not do anything about organ transplants, which I guess would mean that when somebody dies, unless they have said that they wanted their organs transplanted, the hospital would not be able to take it, right? Because the hospital doesn't own the person's body. And then, you might worry that, well, then as in the actual status quo, there aren't enough organs. And then he suggests that, we should just have a free market in organ donations. So like, hospitals should be able to pay people to sign up to be organ donors so that when they die, their organs get taken by the hospital, right? And then, the market will just solve the problem, right? So we don't need to have any libertarian paternalism going on. Okay, now perhaps the best objection to libertarian paternalism that I could find was suggested at the end of Gordon's book review, and this is where he quotes Alexis de Tocqueville. So Alexis de Tocqueville was a French writer in the 19th century who wrote this very famous book called Democracy in America, where he was commenting on kind of the character of America, the people, and the government. This is a quotation from Democracy in America. He says, "Above this race of men stands an immense and tutelary power which takes upon itself alone to secure their gratifications and to watch over their fate. That power is absolute, minute, regular, provident, and mild. The will of a man is not shattered, but softened, bent, and guided. Men are seldom forced by it to act, but they are constantly restrained from acting. Such a power does not destroy, but it prevents existence. It does not tyrannize, but it compresses, enervates, extinguishes, and stupefies a people, till each nation is reduced to nothing better than a flock of timid and industrious animals, of which the government is the shepherd." Now, I take it the idea is that if you have a paternalistic government, so this is not a tyranny like a traditional dictatorship, right? But we imagine this kind of benevolent government that's trying to influence people's behavior because the government knows best. The result of that is, it's treating people like children, and that might cause people to be more like children. It might cause people to become weaker and stupider. They might be less self-reliant, less creative, and so on, because, they're constantly being taken care of by this parent-like government figure, and so they don't know how to take care of themselves. So in conclusion, traditional coercive paternalism has a couple of problems. It's bad because third parties generally do worse at promoting your interests than you do. Also, it reduces your autonomy. Libertarian paternalism, on the other hand, can avoid some of these problems, but it might still worsen people's character by making them less self-reliant.